The Ukrainian army has recently shifted the offensive axis of its major offensive operations in the Donetsk region and Zaporizhia Oblast towards the steppes of Luhansk. The last time the Ukrainian forces managed to break through a Russian trench line of about 1 kilometer in the city of Svardov in Luhansk. Russian troops also faced pressure from offensive operations by the Ukrainians on the Kremenna front line south of the city of Svardov. Of course, there were certain reasons why the Ukrainians were in such an advantageous position in Luhansk. Among the offensive plans of Kiev was the capture of the city of Markiivka. The Ukrainian armed forces had succeeded in capturing the city in the past days after a long struggle thanks to HIMARS and artillery attacks. Here, with the capture of Berezivka, the Ukrainians were able to create an attack corridor from the Donetsk line to Luhansk and cut the Russian supply lines in these areas. As the Russian army was unable to provide military supplies to the front lines of Luhansk, the Ukrainians continued to intensify their attacks and carry out resounding actions in other parts of Luhansk. Finally, the Ukrainian forces carried out another striking offensive operation in the Luhansk region. Let's take a look at the latest situation in this critical region together and discover the effects of the Ukrainian advances on the war. The Ukrainian armed forces struck the Luhansk-Teplovaz complex, the largest Russian military facility in Luhansk, which it temporarily occupied with British Storm Shadow cruise missiles. Local residents reported that the missile attacks on the facility were very severe. A total of 6 explosions occurred in temporarily occupied Luhansk. Storm Shadow cruise missiles also severely damaged areas of industrial enterprises such as the October Revolution factory, the Gloria Jeans factory, and the Luhansk to Santa Cruz factory. All these areas are located within the Luhansk-Teplovaz complex. In other words, this facility is the most important military equipment repair, maintenance, and supply center of the Russians in Luhansk. Russian troops were repairing damaged military equipment at these enterprises, which the Ukrainian forces hit with Storm Shadow missiles. In other words, the Ukrainians, thanks to these striking offensive operations, managed to damage the Russian military resources in Luhansk to a great extent. Relatives near the facility where the explosions took place urgently left the dangerous area. Evacuations are still ongoing because there are possible explosion risks in the region. Thanks to the Ukrainian attacks on the Luhansk-Teplovaz complex, the Russians had to stop military shipments to Ukraine from the northern lines of Luhansk, that is, from the border areas, because Russian leader Vladimir Putin knows very well that the attacks will continue after such counterattacks by the Ukrainian army. So, according to Putin, the Ukrainians will continue to attack areas in Luhansk that the Russians use as military facilities. But Russia's military shipments could resume in a few days. According to estimates, the reason for this is that the Russian troops in Luhansk are very inadequate in terms of military resources. Russian citizens often mobilized in the Luhansk region are fighting in the trench lines. For this reason, Ukraine's professional special forces can easily take advantage of the Russian troops in this region. In addition, the Storm Shadow long-range missiles used by the Ukrainian army are one of the main factors that allow the advantage both in Luhansk and Ukraine's other front lines to pass Kiev. The Ukrainians have made significant progress in the past few weeks using these effective missiles, especially in coastal areas, critical front lines such as Berdyansk, Mariupol, and the southern Ukrainian coast. The Ukrainian army has repeatedly destroyed Russian military targets using Storm Shadow missiles. Dozens of explosions occurred in the past few days at the Russian-controlled air base in Berdyansk. Likewise, Mariupol is among the fronts that witnessed the missile attacks of the Ukrainians. And most recently, as you can see in the Luhansk-Teplovaz complex, the Ukrainians were able to use Storm Shadow missiles to change the general course of the eastern front lines in the Donetsk region. The situation is not different from Luhansk. Here too, the Ukrainian troops do not turn a blind eye to the Russians with their missile and artillery attacks. The Ukrainians were able to break through the Russian trench of about 2,000 meters in the city of Bakhmut. Wagner's forces still continue to attack Ukrainians on Bakhmut's central front lines ever since they ceded control of the city to Russian troops. But offensive operations by Wagner mercenaries are not having much effect as Ukrainian troops still blockade Bakhmut from the flanks. Ukrainian counterattacks have also affected the eastern front lines such as Marinka and Solder, as well as Bakhmut and Marinka. Russian troops are struggling to resist Ukrainian troops due to insufficient military resources and other unfavorable conditions in Solder. On the other hand, while Wagner forces continue to gradually withdraw from some areas, the Ukrainians wanted to completely end the Wagner Russian domination there. So how did the Ukrainians come to such an advantageous position now? The irony is that while the occupation had spawned a small industry of amateur and professional war mappers who eagerly post their colorful interpretations of the tides of the front lines on social media, success in war is not really measured in these terms because the real purpose is much different. Ukraine's true aim is to render Russian forces unable to resist by smashing their supply and command lines, demoralizing them, and forcing them into clearly untenable positions. So if Ukrainians die doing it, reclaiming a city that may not matter, but if they can get the Russians down to a level where they can't continue the war, it doesn't matter what they do or don't do. Still, progress on the ground will be a very important measure, not only for the Ukrainian people but also for Vladimir Putin and the West. One reason NATO members decided to increase their support this year was the hope that a more convincing victory for Ukraine on the battlefield would shock Putin, making him rethink his invasion. This may be impossibly optimistic, but Kyiv needs to prove to Western boosters and skeptics alike that it holds the initiative, that victory is possible, and that war won't last forever. The Ukrainians raised at least 3 of their own brigades, along with 9 new brigades trained and equipped by the West, added to the existing reserves. This means that they could have 20 brigades or 100,000 soldiers to throw into the fray. There are perhaps 200,000 Russians against them. Many of these mobilized reserve units whose training and morale are questionable but leavened with the remnants of combat experienced paratroopers and other professional forces. Of course, the Russians know that the Ukrainians will come for them, apart from Bakhmut and a few other hotspots. The Russians are reducing their offensive operations and bracing themselves for the coming storm along most of the front. They build extensive lines of defense with trenches, razor wire, minefields, and concrete dragon's teeth, anti-tank barriers. The goal is not only to confuse and slow down the Ukrainian forces so that they can be killed by Russia's still deadly artillery, but also to keep the Russian troops in place. Still, the Ukrainians are holding the initiative and will decide where to fight. Moving south into the Zaporizhia region opens up the possibility of liberating the cities of Melitopol and Mariupol. Mariupol has become especially symbolic given the 83-day siege that devastated it and the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. More importantly, it could cut the land, bridge, road, and rail link to Crimea. This would force the Russians to rely on the Kerch Bridge and air and sea routes for reinforcements and supplies, all of which would be open to prohibition. Instead of trying to attack the heavily defended peninsula, the Ukrainian army could have simply surrounded it. However, Kyiv's ingenious plan aims both to gain the upper hand in tank and trench battles on the Luhansk and Donetsk front lines and to win strategic battles on the southern front lines. Russia's once again cornered with the Ukrainian offensive in Luhansk. Russian soldiers in the region were forced to surrender. Ukraine once again proved its strength, and the Russian army's dominance in Luhansk came to an end. The Ukrainian army continues to retake the occupied territories one by one. The Russian army suffered one of its biggest defeats in this region. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is thought to be playing his last trump cards. Russia is experiencing difficult times with the current situation. With the steady victories and steady rise of the Ukrainian army, the Russian army is being driven to despair. The constant defeats in this war, which many countries are closely following and somehow involved in, are mentally exhausting the Russian soldiers. These soldiers who have already been taken into the war against their will have started to look for a way to escape, with the army getting worse by the day. As the news of desertions from the army increases day by day, Putin is pursuing even stricter policies to keep his soldiers in the army. But no matter how hard Putin's policies get, it is not possible to keep these soldiers in the army. Russian soldiers who have witnessed the deaths of soldiers who came with mobilization one by one do not want to share the same fate. For this reason, even though they know that there is a shooting order, if they are killed, the soldiers do their best to escape from the army. The problems within the Russian army are not limited to this. At the same time, the inability of the Russian government to keep up with the needs of the army increases the problems in the army even more. Due to the Russian government's failure to predict that the war would come to this point, the financial problems in the army are showing themselves more clearly every day. With these financial problems coming to the surface, the care of the soldiers has also suffered a great disruption. Soldiers are not only suffering from a lack of equipment and ammunition, they are also suffering from a lack of nutrition. Malnourished soldiers are also unable to meet their personal care needs. Due to this lack of care, epidemics and misery within the army cannot be prevented. But despite this, Russian leader Vladimir Putin continues to recruit new soldiers every day. On the other hand, the Ukrainian army is able to improve itself without interruption with the support it receives. Despite all this chaos in the Russian army, the fact that the Ukrainian army is constantly on the rise gives the Russian government a great panic. Due to this panic, Vladimir Putin is constantly trying to try new ways, and all these ways found by Vladimir Putin continue to cause greater damage to the army. The Ukrainian government, which wants to turn this chaos in its favor, has started to move forward through its strategic regions, focusing on the Luhansk region. In this way, the Ukrainian army easily identified the lack of Russian power in the region. Acting on this determination, the army achieved one of the most important victories in the region. Russia has been taking rash decisions to conclude the war as soon as possible for a long time. One of these decisions was to focus on the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar and to capture these regions as soon as possible and advance to Kiev. But Russia left the regions it held in this way vulnerable. The Russian army, which was short of soldiers, sent many soldiers from the Luhansk region to take power in the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar. In this way, the protection of this region, which is very strong in terms of Russian troops, has been considerably reduced. Taking advantage of the situation, the Ukrainian army created a clever plan and advanced to this region with a large force acting according to the intelligence they received from the Russian army. The Ukrainian army acted very cautiously in the region, leaving Russian troops no chance to protect themselves. The Ukrainian army organized small-scale attacks in the Luhansk region in order to provoke the Russian army, which was experiencing military insufficiency. Russian soldiers who were not aware of Ukraine's plans defended themselves by opening fire against these attacks. However, Russian soldiers took great care to keep these defenses to a minimum. The reason for this was that they underestimated the Ukrainian power in the region and did not see it as a serious threat. Realizing this, Ukrainian troops turned the situation in their favor, playing one move after another to prove their strength. Ukrainian troops ensured that the Russian army suffered a great defeat. The Ukrainian army, which identified the Russian headquarters in the region, bombarded these headquarters and shocked the Russian soldiers in an instant. Russian soldiers who did not expect such an attack were defenseless against the incoming missiles. On top of all this, the Ukrainian army suddenly launched a much larger attack, giving the Russian army a second shock. The Ukrainian army, which deployed HIMARS in the Luhansk region, posed a great threat to the Russian soldiers who were known to be defenseless. With the activation of the missiles, Russian soldiers are prepared for such an attack. Did not know what to do. The Russian soldiers who were devastated by the blows of the Ukrainian army one by one had to surrender after a while, even if some soldiers tried to continue the conflict. The Ukrainian army managed to neutralize these soldiers in a short time and cleared the region in this way. The Ukrainian army, which guaranteed its dominance in the region, inflicted a very heavy damage on Russia. During the conflict, the Ukrainian army, which did not even allow the Russian army to intervene with tanks, destroyed these tanks with armor-piercing weapons. With the elimination of the tanks of the Russian army, which is known to suffer from a shortage of armored vehicles, it has entered a difficult period financially. Again, if the Russian army, which is constantly losing its high-cost equipment, continues in this way, it will continue to experience large budget deficits. The statements of war analysts draw attention to exactly these budget deficits. The consequences of the Russian government's underestimating and even outright underestimating of Ukraine's power have been much more severe than expected. Vladimir Putin's policies, which did not even anticipate that the whole world would unite against this injustice, have always led to worse consequences. Against this backdrop, war analysts believe that the victory of the Ukrainian army is imminent and that it will be very difficult for the Russian army to recover from this war. These data are actually an indication that all the countries of the world have achieved their goals, because it was thought that Vladimir Putin would not stop if he succeeded in invading Ukraine. If Russia, which has nuclear missiles that pose a great danger to the whole world, uses these weapons, many countries would be irrevocably affected. Even if this nuclear power is not used, Russia, which will begin the invasion of many more countries, will also jeopardize world peace. A World War III with advanced technology and modern weapons could cause unprecedented destruction, since it will take many years for the whole world to recover from this war. No country wants to get involved in such a war. But despite all this, it is thought that Vladimir Putin's main goal is to start this Third World War. The Russian leader, who has made provocative statements against many countries with his statements, has also fallen out with his own allies. For this reason, although he is constantly demanding new negotiations with his former allies, these countries are constantly rejecting Putin's demands. Putin has realized that he has been backed into a corner and that he cannot stand up to the whole world. But now that this realization has come too late, Russia is in irreversible trouble. What happens between Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov, who has been absent for a long time, and Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has created a big shock in Russia. Russian Minister Shoigu, who was held responsible for the Ukrainian army's operations on Russia's borders, was threatened with dismissal by Ramzan Kadyrov. Kadyrov, who is known to be on good terms with Vladimir Putin, has reached a power to threaten even Russia's defense minister with the support he has received from Putin in the past days. Pro-Ukrainian Russian Freedom Legion soldiers have managed to enter Russian borders and seize 2 different towns in the city of Belgorod. This offensive operation, organized by the Ukrainian army, quickly entered the agenda of the whole world. While this operation was a great success for Ukraine, it was a complete failure for Russia. There are big question marks about how these towns, which are still under the control of the Ukrainian army, were captured. Putin, who held a meeting at the Kremlin Palace shortly after the Ukrainian army's operation, harshly criticized the Russian intelligence service Sergei Naryshkin and the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu. During the meeting, according to sources close to the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin blames defense minister Sergei Shoigu for the loss of these towns. Russian General Valery Gerasimov withdrew a large number of Russian troops from Kharkov and deployed them on the territory of Belgorod in order to stop the Ukrainian army's advance on Belgorod. At the same time, the Russian troops in Belgorod, who had been recruited and held in readiness under a partial mobilization order, were fully mobilized. Days later, Russian Minister Shoigu made a statement saying that they would remove the Ukrainian army from Russian territory. However, during his statement, Shoigu's remarks against Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov angered Kadyrov. Russian Minister Shoigu made it clear that Chechen troops were providing border security in the region when the Ukrainian army was on the offensive, but that Chechen soldiers preferred to retreat instead of clashing with the Ukrainian army. In other words, he put the blame for the loss of these towns in Belgorod entirely on Chechen soldiers under Ramzan Kadyrov. Shortly after the statement made by Shoigu, Ramzan Kadyrov arrived at the Kremlin Palace and asked for a private meeting with Shoigu. Upon Kadyrov's request, the planned meeting was held inside the palace. However, it was learned that the tension was quite high during the meeting, and Ramzan Kadyrov threatened Sergei Shoigu. According to sources close to the Kremlin, Ramzan Kadyrov accused Defense Minister Shoigu of lying and slander. Kadyrov stated that all church and troops were deployed within the borders of Ukraine and that no Chechen soldier was assigned to provide border security. It is said that Ramzan Kadyrov shouting echoed throughout the palace as the argument intensified. Chechen leader Kadyrov shouted at Shoigu and threatened to dismiss him as minister. Kadyrov, Strato dismissed Shoigu despite not having such authority, confused everyone. However, as it is known, Ramzan Kadyrov had previously threatened to dismiss Sergei Surovikin, who was the commander of the Russian army, and shortly after, Surovikin was dismissed by Putin. Soon after, he was replaced by Valery Gerasimov, Russia's chief of general staff. The fact that Kadyrov has such a big say in the Russian government disturbs many senior Russian officials, but Putin is not bothered by it. Putin is aware that thanks to Kadyrov's support, he is able to continue his occupation of Ukrainian territory more quickly, and he does not want his alliance with Kadyrov to be damaged. As the shouting between Kadyrov and Shoigu escalated, Russian National Guardsmen from the palace entered the meeting room and prevented any brawl between the two. Shortly afterwards, Russian leader Vladimir Putin entered the palace, and the discussion between the two continued as if it had never happened. However, since Minister Kadyrov's words were overheard by many staff and officials in the palace, this may have hurt Shoigu's pride. It would not be surprising if Vladimir Putin has to choose between Shoigu or Ramzan Kadyrov in the coming days. As is well-known, Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov has been making a lot of sudden exits like this months ago, while the Russian army continued its occupation of Ukrainian territory. The war was suddenly turned in favor of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian army carried out successful operations against the Russian forces. The headquarters where Chechen troops were stationed were destroyed as a result of airstrikes organized by the Ukrainian army. Kadyrov, who lost many of his soldiers, was very angry about the situation, making a statement on this issue. Kadyrov said that the Russian army was not well managed and that he should be in charge of the army. Immediately after these words of Kadyrov, the army commander, Sergei Surovikin, was quickly dismissed by Putin. The biggest reason why Ramzan Kadyrov had so much influence was that tens of thousands of Chechen soldiers were fighting for Putin in Ukraine. But not all Chechens are fighting for Vladimir Putin. There are also Chechen troops who are fighting alongside the Ukrainian army. These Chechen volunteers are fighting alongside the Ukrainian army against Russian forces, but their main goal is to liberate Chechnya from Ramzan Kadyrov, stating that Ramzan Kadyrov is a puppet of Vladimir Putin. The volunteer Chechen soldiers say that they will do whatever they can to liberate Chechnya and Ukraine. The war between Russia and Ukraine is now in its 16th month. Although not reported by the Russian media, the turmoil in the Russian army has been increasing as time passes. The biggest reason for this is the disagreements within the army. As it is known, there are many minority soldiers fighting with the Russian army, such as Chechen soldiers. At the same time, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the founder of the Wagner mercenary company known as Putin's close friend, has sent all his mercenaries to Ukrainian territory. Putin's mistakes are now causing confusion within the army. Putin, who wanted to find more soldiers to fight, sent prisoners from prisons in Russia to fight on Ukrainian soil through the Wagner company. Realizing that he could not include these prisoners in the army, Putin sent tens of thousands of prisoners to fight in Ukraine through the Wagner company. However, after a while, these prisoner soldiers became a big problem for Putin on Ukrainian soil. Prisoner soldiers started to treat Chechen soldiers as second-class soldiers, leading to class divisions. Wagner soldiers stationed in the same headquarters with Chechen soldiers started to confiscate ammunition and supplies sent to the headquarters. While these supplies sent by Putin were supposed to be divided equally, the Wagner unit commanders divided the majority of the supplies among themselves and gave the rest to minority soldiers. After a while, this became a big problem. The Chechen commander, who wanted to raise his voice against the situation, met with the Wagner commander in the quarters. However, the conversation turned into a verbal argument after a while. Shortly afterwards, a brawl broke out between the Wagner commander and the Chechen commander. As a result of the brawl between the commanders, Chechen soldiers and Wagner soldiers in the headquarters also got into each other. When the brawl was about to turn into a disaster, the soldiers were separated from each other. When the senior Ukrainian commander in the headquarters opened fire in the air. Although such incidents are not reported by the Russian press, it is a known fact that there is great confusion within the Russian army. According to information obtained from independent news agencies and Telegram channels. If this continues, the Russian army fighting on the territory of Ukraine will be on the verge of a major disaster.